It's hot as Hades in here today. I know I look like the devil. And that's because I'm in hell. But I'm reporting to you from hell in order to teach you one of the most critical and vital lessons you will ever learn about menopause. Hopefully, I won't be burned to a crisp before I finish delivering the lesson for today. So welcome back to Menopause University, where I'm going to liken things to a living hell today. The last two video tutorials have put things into perspective by comparing different cancers in video number 452 and different anatomical aspects of density in video 453. In so doing, you are able to see the big picture in terms of how these things affect your menopausal life. Well, today, I'm going to give you yet another big picture perspective. And this time, I'll address the overall effects of the infamous Women's Health Initiative study on your menopausal life. But before I get started, let me just say that I think the very name of the WHI study is incorrect. I don't think it should be the Women's Health Initiative. I think it should be the Women's Hell Initiative. Instead of leaving women in a better state of health, it has left them in a worse state of health. It did nothing but initiate eternal hell for menopausal women. Now, I'm not one to use cuss words, but I will say it was an initiative rather than an initiative. So I'm going to explain how this one study went from being a flicker to a flame and then to a fiery furnace or inferno. And in the process, it became somewhat of a crematorium for women everywhere. Hell, it sure is difficult to do anything with double claws. I can't even pick up my book. In any case, if you have my book, you need to know that, as with most comparative perspectives, this is yet another video bonus. And in my humble opinion, I think it might just be the most comprehensive video thus far. You definitely need to watch this video to understand why the WHI smoked you out and will ultimately burn you out. Because there's no way I could possibly create the essence of damnation in my book that I can here in this video. So, the reason you should watch this video is that it will address the effect of the WHI on all the diseases we studied to which it pertains so far. Heart attack, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's, and breast cancer. One video that puts all these diseases into perspective with regard to the Women's Health Initiative. The best place to begin is with the state of affairs before the WHI was ever done. Back before it all went to hell in a single newscasting. So here's a little history lesson. Until the year 1900, women didn't live long enough to experience menopause. Until then, the average female lifespan did not extend past the age of about 47. So menopause was either unknown or unnamed before about 1900. And since nobody knew what to make of the few women who did experience menopause, everybody thought they were just going crazy, so they ended up in asylums. Nobody understood why the occasional menopausal woman would exhibit raging moods and inflamed joints and conflagration of various symptoms. But around 1900, our lifespans increased to the point where menopause became routine. And this was somewhat of a shock to womankind because other animals don't have menopause. Mother Nature's plan for animals is simply birth, reproduction, and death. So, the emergence of menopause as a routine event in women approaching their 50s was new indeed. And once all women started living long enough to experience it, people realized that these women were not going crazy. Instead, they were quite literally outliving their ovaries. Ovaries were well known to be egg and hormone factories. And the crucial ovarian hormone that became deficient in menopause was estrogen. So it became readily apparent that women now routinely live long enough to experience estrogen deficiency. And that's why women complained about their bodies radiating heat and their vaginas being on fire. Well, since women hadn't been living long enough to experience estrogen deficiency previously, everybody was unprepared to deal with a bunch of postmenopausal estrogen deficient females with hot flashes and burning vaginas. But when women first started living long enough to experience estrogen deficiency, they didn't live very long afterward. So, for a time, it was just a matter of elderly women having symptoms of estrogen deficiency for a few years before they died. And since there was no such thing as estrogen replacement, menopause was thought of as something that you just ran its course until you died. But then, lifespans got longer and longer and longer. And as women lived for longer periods of time with estrogen deficiency, it became apparent that estrogen deficiency was like any other hormone deficiency. The basic science of all hormone deficiencies is the same. First, you have a long list of symptoms that make you feel miserable. And if you fail to replace the deficient hormone adequately, there are fatal diseases that ensue. So by the mid-1900s, women were living long enough to develop and exhibit the diseases that are due to estrogen deficiency: heart attack, osteoporosis, and Alzheimer's. So this is when people realized that estrogen deficiency wasn't merely a matter of superficial symptoms amounting to superficial scorching. It constituted something more akin to deep, third-degree burns. Well, since all other hormone deficiencies were treated by taking hormone replacement in order to prevent the fatal diseases of the hormone deficiency, the notion of replacing estrogen at the time of menopause came about. And scientists started looking for sources to make estrogen replacement therapies. The very first estrogen replacement was a product called Premarin, made from the urine of pregnant mares. And since it was the only estrogen replacement option available, it became standard of practice to give it to all women when they approached the age of menopause. And lo and behold, what do you know? It prevented the fatal diseases of estrogen deficiency. It seems to douse the raging fire that menopause could become and keep it nicely under control. So, for about 50 years preceding the WHI study, it was plainly obvious in the medical community that menopause was the result of hormone deficiency and that taking estrogen replacement was the solution. So, before the WHI, all women took estrogen replacement at menopause. And the very reason they took it was to prevent the fatal diseases of estrogen deficiency. Alleviation of symptoms was merely a secondary perk. The standard dosages of estrogen were always enough to prevent the diseases, exactly as it is for all other hormone replacement therapies for other hormone deficiencies. And when it became apparent that progesterone was necessary to prevent uterine cancer, it was prescribed along with estrogen for all women bearing a uterus. So, all women took their hormone replacement for the rest of their lives, just like you do for all other hormone replacement therapies for other hormone deficiencies. The basic science and proof of disease prevention were so clear that Premarin manufacturers blatantly stated on the package labeling that estrogen replacement prevented heart attack, osteoporosis, and Alzheimer's. As the 1990s came about, other estrogen replacement products became available, and they too stated prevention of these diseases on their labels. Then, in 1995, some researchers decided to actually put estrogen and estrogen plus progesterone to the test in terms of whether or not they really prevented these diseases. And this is where things started blowing up. What the hell? What was the initiative for that? We already had the evidence, research, and logic we needed to treat deficient estrogen at menopause like any other hormone deficiency. Well, the initiative consisted of many things, and I will delineate all of them for you. And I'll do so by disease, starting with heart attack. In the unit on heart attack, video number 178 addressed all the studies on HRT and heart attack that led up to the WHI study. In that video, you learned that from the late 1800s until the early 1900s, doctors discovered 3 critical things that set the stage for recognizing a relationship between menopause and heart attacks. 1, women did not have heart attacks until they became postmenopausal. 2, young women with premature menopause did have heart attacks. And 3, young women who had surgical menopause also had heart attacks. Then, in the early 1900s, it was discovered that taking HRT at the time of menopause and beyond prevented heart attacks. Between 1987 and 2002, 2 studies showed that HRT could improve lipids and blood pressure as well as stabilize or retard atherosclerosis. Then, studies in 2000 through 2001 revealed that HRT could reduce risk or prevent heart attack in women who did not already have heart disease, but it could not reduce risk or prevent heart attack in women who already did have heart disease. And HRT could not lower the risk of heart attack in women who already had lipid buildup in their heart arteries, nor could HRT reverse atherosclerosis. So, with all of that as common knowledge, the WHI researchers set out to re-evaluate whether or not HRT could prevent heart attacks. Now, heart attacks are a cardiologist's bread and butter. So I'm sure no cardiologist was happy about the fact that all HRT products listed prevention of heart attack on their labels. Of course, cardiologists know absolutely nothing about menopause. All they know is that menopause used to make women prone to heart attacks, which made lots of money for cardiologists. But with HRT, lots fewer women had heart attacks, which made a lot less money for cardiologists. Well, guess what kind of physician decided to head the WHI study and put a stop to the notion that HRT could prevent heart attacks? You got it, a cardiologist. What the hell? That was the underlying initiative of the whole darn thing. And that initiative set the stage for the entire design of the hell-bent WHI study. Previous studies had already established that HRT only prevents heart attack if women start taking it before they go without estrogen long enough to allow atherosclerosis to develop. So, for a study on whether HRT can prevent heart attacks, it would only make sense to study women at the beginning of their menopause. But the WHI didn't do that. The average age of the women in the WHI study was 63, and they had not taken HRT ever before. This means that they had been without estrogen for over 10 years. What the hell? That's plenty of time for atherosclerosis to develop. The WHI claimed that it was a trial of healthy women. However, 50% were smokers, 33% were overweight, 33% had high blood pressure, and 4% had diabetes. Every one of those is a risk factor for heart attack. So these women were already at high risk for a heart attack. If you add that to the fact that they had been post-menopausal for over 10 years, you can be sure that they were at really high risk for a heart attack. So what you have is a study on already heart attack-prone menopausal women designed by a cardiologist who wants to show that HRT does not prevent heart attacks. Hell! Oh, but that's not all, my dears. The plot thickens. All scientific study designs must match the objectives of the study. If you set out to study prevention, the study design must pertain to prevention. If you set out to study cause, the study design must pertain to cause. You are not allowed to design a study for prevention and then switch gears mid-study to cause. You are also not allowed to do a study on prevention and then report the results in terms of cause. But what the hell? That's precisely what the Women's Hell Initiative did. The actual results were that heart attacks increased 26% in women who took both estrogen and progestogen if they had been estrogen deficient for over 10 years, already had atherosclerosis, and already had many other cardiac risk factors. The actual numbers translated into 7 more heart attacks per 10,000 women per year. But hell, that was nothing new. Previous studies had already demonstrated this. And the part that you didn't hear was that the risk of heart attack in women between the ages of 50 and 59 who took estrogen alone was decreased by 50%. So this one study, with its flawed design and faulty reporting, is the one that freaked everyone out and still does today. What the hell? Well, after the initial initiative frenzy settled down, all the data from the WHI was reanalyzed. And the ultimate conclusion was that initiation of HRT in the early years of post-menopause is associated with lower rates of heart attack. But as you increase the length of time between estrogen loss and initiation of HRT, the rate of heart attack increases. And once lipid has built up in your arteries, HRT cannot reverse it. This has become what is known as the timing hypothesis. And it's all the same stuff I taught you in videos 80 through 90 on the estrogen window of opportunity. Simply put, if you begin HRT in the early years of your postmenopause, before your arteries are clogged with lipids, you can prevent the clogging and prevent a heart attack. But if you don't start HRT in your early postmenopause and you go more than 5 to 10 years without it, HRT will not reverse any clogging you already have, nor will it prevent a heart attack. And at that point, it may even cause a heart attack if your heart arteries just can't handle it anymore. So, the WHI should have made a distinction between prevention and cause, but it didn't. Ultimately, it did not tell us anything we didn't already know, but it did serve to scare the hell out of women needlessly, and in so doing, it made a lot of women go through a lot of hell for nothing. Ultimately, the women's hell initiative puts you at risk for letting your heart arteries become fried because you're afraid to take hormone replacement in order to prevent it. The bottom line is simple. HRT can prevent heart attack if you take it before you have heart disease. HRT can cause heart attack if you take it once you already have heart disease. And HRT cannot treat heart disease once you have it. After I taught you all this stuff about the women's hell initiative and heart attack, I addressed it in the unit on osteoporosis. And video 223 was all about that. You learned that before the WHI, it was common knowledge that estrogen loss caused bone loss. And estrogen replacement prevented bone loss. Of course, the very definition of osteoporosis is bone loss. Study after study after study had proven that estrogen replacement at menopause prevented osteoporosis. The main purpose of the WHI was to address the effect of HRT on heart attack. That's because a cardiologist with his own agenda was the head investigator. The effect of HRT on osteoporosis was an add-on. The WHI researchers were so hell-bent on scaring women away from HRT that they switched gears in terms of what they studied. But the WHI was even more hellacious than that. In addition to switching gears on what they studied, the WHI conducted the entire study using a design to assess prevention, but then reported the results in terms of cause. What the hell? And as I stated earlier, you can't do that in scientific research. So when you heard the results of the WHI, you never heard about any of the things that HRT really does prevent. And osteoporosis is one of them. So even though the average age of women in the WHI study was 63, and even though these women had already endured over 10 years with no estrogen, and even though these women had already lost a lot of bone, they still had fewer fractures from osteoporosis than the women who did not take HRT. In the group of women who took both estrogen and progestogen, there was a 33% decrease in hip fractures and a 24% decrease in all fractures of the spine, hip, and wrist. 33 fewer hip fractures constituted 5 fewer fractures per 10,000 women per year. Since this arm of the WHI lasted 5.2 years, that amounts to 25 fewer fractures. In the group of women who took estrogen all by itself, the numbers were similar, and that's because progestogen has nothing to do with preventing bone loss. Before the WHI study took place, estrogen was considered the very best option for preventing bone loss, but no longer. Now, because the WHI broke all the rules in switching from studying prevention to addressing cause, and 2, because they extrapolated the negative results to all uses of HRT, and 3, because the media chose to tell you only the scary, distorted results, and 4, because the public reacted with fear of HRT, and 5, because doctors reacted with fear of litigation from prescribing HRT, we now now have a situation in which people seem to have completely forgotten the benefits of estrogen on bone. Now, even though there is no question that estrogen is the very best option for preventing osteoporosis, it's not even offered anymore. All because of the WHI. What the hell? So now, if you have osteopenia or osteoporosis, your doctor is going to tell you to do weight-bearing exercise and take calcium and vitamin D, none of which can prevent bone loss or treat either osteopenia or osteoporosis. It's a terrible shame, really. The solution for preventing bone loss and fractures is just so obvious, but everyone is afraid to use it. Ultimately, the Women's Health Initiative puts you at risk for letting your bones disintegrate, all because you're afraid to take hormone replacement in order to prevent it. And that's why 90% of every nursing home consists of women who have fractured from osteoporosis. So the WHI doomed women to live lives of eternal hell. The Women's Health Initiative casts such a dark shadow that it completely blinded everyone to the things that used to be so clear. It really did create hell for women. It set the stage for women to burn in hell forever. Now for the WHI findings on Alzheimer's. In the unit on Alzheimer's, video number 276 was all about the WHI. Before the WHI debacle, half a century of research studies had clearly demonstrated that HRT in general and estrogen replacement in particular prevented Alzheimer's. In the Alzheimer's unit, I taught you that the original WHI did not even study the effect of HRT on Alzheimer's. It simply wasn't addressed at all. So Alzheimer's was yet another add-on that represented a switching of gears in terms of what it studied. It wasn't until a full year after the original WHI results were announced, when women everywhere were already freaking out and believing that HRT would give them a heart attack and kill them, that the WHI investigators went back to the original data to see what else they could scrounge up. In video number 276, I explained that they did something called data mining. Data mining is when the researchers go back to their data and scrounge around for a statistical association that further supports their hypothesis. The key to understanding data mining is realizing that the significant statistical association was not there before they scrounged around for it. They had to uncover it by rearranging the data. So it involves taking things out of context in order to justify your hypothesis. I taught you that Alzheimer's starts developing long before there are any signs or symptoms of the disease. By the time there are any symptoms of Alzheimer's, 40% of your brain has already disappeared. This means that the disease process begins at least a decade before symptoms develop. So, if they want to determine if HRT causes Alzheimer's, researchers have to study young perimenopausal women or newly postmenopausal women who are very unlikely to already have undetected Alzheimer's as a result of estrogen deficiency. And if the researchers are going to go back to previous data collected in the original WHI study on women who are an average age of 63 and have never taken HRT, they would have to study the youngest ones in order to assess anything about Alzheimer's. But that's not what the WHI researchers did. Instead, once the public was already running around Scared of HRT and talking about the shocking WHI results, the WHI researchers decided to drop another bomb and add fire to the flame. It was called WHIMS, WHIMS, for the Women's Health Initiative Memory Study. It reanalyzed a group of 7,427 of the WHI subjects, all over the age of 65. What the hell? And they reported that HRT doubled the risk of Alzheimer's in women aged 65 and older. They also reported that the increased risk of Alzheimer's occurred in the very first year of taking HRT. What the hell? That alone means that Alzheimer's was already there before these women ever started taking HRT. So the Women's Health Initiative really set women up for a hellish future for nothing. The truth was that women who did not already have cognitive impairment had a lower risk of ever getting Alzheimer's. In other words, HRT prevented Alzheimer's just as all the studies that came before it had shown. Ultimately, the Women's Health Initiative put you at risk for letting your brain turn to ashes, all because you're afraid to take hormone replacement in order to prevent it. Are you on fire with anger about all this? If so, you have every right to be. The WHI really is the Women's Health Initiative. If you believe it, you're going to get burned. Now, what about breast cancer? Women seem to be more afraid of breast cancer than they are of any of these other diseases. What did the WHI tell us about breast cancer? In the breast cancer unit, video number 384 addressed the WHI findings on breast cancer. And the theme of that entire video was, liar, liar, breasts on fire. So let's address what happened. Breast cancer was the excuse the investigators gave for dramatically stopping the estrogen and progestogen arm of the study early. The study was supposed to be an 8.5-year-long study, but they stopped the estrogen plus progestogen arm at 5.2 years. And they claimed to have done so due to an increased risk of invasive breast cancer. The hellacious thing about this is they used the disease women fear most in order to scare them away from taking HRT. But having learned all that I've taught you about cancers, you know that it takes a minimum of 7 years for a cancer to grow from one cell to the size that is diagnosable as cancer. So how in the world could HRT have caused diagnosable breast cancer in 5.2 years if that process takes 7 years? It couldn't have. The breast cancers diagnosed during the WHI study had to have been there before the study began. The WHI claimed that women taking estrogen plus progestogen had a 26% increased risk of breast cancer. That translates to a risk increase from 1 in 6 to 1 in 5. And this was an increase in the total number of women who got breast cancer, not an increased risk for an individual woman. So instead of 1 in 6 women getting breast cancer, 1 in 5 women got breast cancer. That 26% increased risk amounted to 8 more breast cancers per 10,000 women per year for women in the estrogen plus progestogen arm of the study. 8 more per 10,000. That's only a 0.26 times increase in risk. And these results were admittedly insignificant. That means they could have been due to chance alone and had nothing to do whatsoever with the HRT. So this amounted to the first huge flaw in the Women's Health Initiative. A second huge flaw in the Women's Health Initiative is that it did not study both the continuous regimen and the cyclic regimen of HRT. And you know that your risk of breast cancer is more dependent on your number of cycles than just about anything else. Had it studied both, it could have compared the two, but hell, it didn't. A third huge flaw is that the WHO used only one kind of estrogen and one kind of progestogen, both of which happen to be the ones that are used least in reality. So now you're stuck with doctors and patients extrapolating the results from rarely used HRT products to commonly used HRT products, even though we know that there are huge differences in their effects. The fourth big flaw is that ever since the original WHI in 2002, the researchers have lied, changed the story, unsuccessfully explained away their false data, and finally admitted that their data were insignificant. In essence, now they put you in a state of eternal hell, but they finally decided to reluctantly admit that they didn't mean to start a fire in the first place. Bloody hell! Of course, there were two separate arms of the original WHI study. The second arm involved women without their uteri who took estrogen all by itself. It continued after the estrogen plus progestogen arm ended, but only for another year. The researchers stopped it because they said that continuing it would not have changed the results. That was not a valid reason for stopping the study. Hell, nobody can predict whether or not continuing a study will change the results. What is true is that the WHI had already terrified women so much that nothing would have changed their reluctance to take HRT. The WHI had already done the damage of making women's lives hell. In the estrogen alone arm, there was actually a decrease in the rate of breast cancer in women taking estrogen all by itself without progestogen, and this was found for women of all ages. Think about it. Despite the fact that the increased risk of breast cancer with estrogen plus progestogen was insignificant and too early to have been caused by HRT, and despite the fact that estrogen alone actually decreases your risk of breast cancer, you have probably fallen prey to the lie that HRT causes breast cancer. Ultimately, the Women's Health Initiative put you in a situation of 1, fearing breast cancer so much that you're afraid to take hormone replacement in order to prevent all the fatal diseases of estrogen deficiency, and 2, enduring symptoms that are a living hell for the rest of your life. So, before the Women's Health Initiative, all women took estrogen replacement at menopause. And the very reason they took it was to prevent the fatal diseases of estrogen deficiency. Alleviation of symptoms was merely a secondary perk. The standard dosages of estrogen were always high enough to prevent the diseases. And when it became apparent that progesterone was necessary to prevent uterine cancer, it was prescribed to all women bearing a uterus. And all women took their hormone replacement for the rest of their lives. Well, after the Women's Health Initiative, all of that changed. In fact, every single one of those practices was turned completely upside down to change the entire standard of care. Let's make a comparison chart to reflect the standard of care before the WHI and after the WHI. Before the WHI, all women were candidates for HRT. After the WHI, only women with severe symptoms of menopause were candidates for HRT. Before the WHI, the primary purpose of HRT was prevention of fatal diseases. After the WHI, the primary purpose of HRT was alleviation of symptoms. Before the WHI, the secondary purpose of HRT was alleviation of symptoms. After the WHI, the secondary purpose of HRT was prevention of fatal diseases. Before the WHI, the dosage of HRT was always enough to prevent the fatal diseases. After the WHI, the dosage of HRT was the lowest dosage, only enough to alleviate severe symptoms. Before the WHI, the duration of HRT was for the rest of your life. After the WHI, the duration of HRT was the shortest time possible. So there you have it. A comparison of how things were before and after the infamous, disastrous, malicious, hellacious Women's Hell Initiative. And now you understand why I've changed its name. I don't know about you, but I'm mad as hell about this. This one study has served to, quite literally, make the menopausal lives of women a living hell. The summary is that we were all better off before this study was ever done, and it's created eternal hell for women ever since it was done. The chart is your other summary, and you can find the chart at menopausetailored.me, where you can also exercise the initiative to schedule a consultation. You need one in order to tailor all of this stuff specifically to you. I'll teach you how to navigate the completely goofy system that has been in place ever since the Women's Hell Initiative became the Menopause Bible. Please take the initiative to subscribe here to my newsletter and to my channel. And do follow me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, everything. And next week I'll start a little unit on polycystic ovary syndrome, otherwise known as PCOS. Bye, my dears.